You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
There is a lake in the American West that has spent decades hiding its own history from the people who love it most. It sits at over 6,000 feet of elevation, straddling the border between California and Nevada, catching sunlight and scattering it back in shades of cobalt and emerald that make even seasoned travelers stop mid-sentence. Every year, millions of people come to stand at its edge. They take photographs. They swim in it. They drink from it. They call it one of the last truly pristine places in America. They are not entirely wrong, but they are not entirely right either. Because beneath that famous surface, beneath the postcard blue and the sparkling clarity, Lake Tahoe has been holding on to something. Vehicles from another generation sitting on the lake bed as if they were parked there yesterday. Debris from decades of quiet, deliberate disposal. Mysteries that the water was never meant to give up. And in September 2025, for the very first time in recorded history, a robotic camera descended nearly 1,600 feet to the actual floor of this lake and showed the world what was really down there. Then the drought came. And when the water dropped, the shoreline revealed things that had been safely underwater since Eisenhower was president. This is the story of what happens when a lake's secrets run out of room to hide. To understand why Lake Tahoe became such a perfect keeper of secrets, you have to understand what it actually is. Not the postcard version, the geological reality. Lake Tahoe sits at an elevation of approximately 6,225 feet in the Sierra Nevada, formed by a process called tectonic faulting millions of years ago, when enormous blocks of the Earth's crust shifted and dropped, creating a basin with near-vertical walls that plunge almost 1,645 feet straight down. That makes it the second deepest lake in the United States, behind only Oregon's Crater Lake. The water inside that basin is cold. Not refreshingly cold, cold in a way that can be lethal. The deepest water hovers perpetually around 39 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A swimmer in trouble in the shallows has perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia becomes critical. At depth, the cold is absolute and unchanging. It is not warm in summer. It does not fluctuate with the seasons. It simply sits there, a refrigerator the size of a city, perfectly sealed. That cold serves a remarkable preserving function. Biological decay, the process by which organic matter normally breaks down, depends heavily on temperature. In warm water, a submerged object, wood, fabric, metal, anything organic, begins to deteriorate within days or weeks. In Lake Tahoe's deep water, that process slows to a near standstill. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, which has been studying this lake continuously since 1968, has documented temperatures at depth that are biologically inert in practical terms. Things that go down there do not come back up changed. They come back up the way they went in, or they do not come back up at all. The lake's clarity is legendary and equally well documented. The UC Davis team measures visibility using a device called a Secchi disc, a simple white disc lowered into the water until it disappears from view. In the lake's best years, that disc remained visible down to nearly 100 feet. In their most recent 2025 annual report, researchers recorded an average annual clarity of 69.2 feet, a slight improvement from the prior year's 62.3 feet, but still far below the historic benchmark of 97.4 feet recorded in the late 1960s. The lake is clearer than almost any other large body of fresh water on Earth. But it was clearer still before the development boom of the mid-20th century arrived and changed everything. Here is the thing about extraordinary clarity. It only extends so far. Past a certain depth, sunlight ceases to exist entirely. Below roughly 500 feet, the lake becomes a world of total, permanent darkness. Whatever is down there operates beyond the reach of any human eye, any conventional camera, any ordinary monitoring system. For decades, that darkness was the lake's greatest protection, not because of what it contained, but because of what it concealed. Before World War II, Lake Tahoe was difficult to reach. The roads over the Sierra Nevada were challenging in summer and impassable in winter for long stretches. A handful of lodges served wealthy visitors who were willing to make the trip, but the lake remained largely remote and undisturbed. That changed when the war ended. Veterans returned from Europe and the Pacific with money in their pockets, cars in their driveways, and memories of a lake someone had mentioned once at a base in the Central Valley. The Tahoe Basin was accessible now. Military road improvements had seen to that. Casinos opened on the Nevada side, where gambling was legal, drawing entertainers, tourists, and organized crime interests alike. Hotels and resorts multiplied. The Calneva Lodge on the North Shore became a nexus of celebrity, politics, and underworld connections. Frank Sinatra eventually held a gambling license there, and the lodge's clientele included some of the most famous and most dangerous names of the era. The development came fast. Faster, certainly, than the environmental regulations that would eventually follow. In the 1950s, the concept of hazardous waste disposal barely existed in practical terms. Industries operating in the Tahoe Basin, automotive services, metal processing operations, dry cleaning establishments, photographic laboratories, laundry facilities serving the growing hotel industry, all generated toxic byproducts. Lead compounds, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, industrial solvents. Under the regulatory framework of the time, disposal options were limited and expensive. And Lake Tahoe was right there. The practice of using the lake as a dumping ground was neither entirely hidden nor entirely public. It was the kind of open secret that locals absorbed without discussing, and tourists never learned. Construction crews disposed of debris directly into the water at access points along the shore. Old vehicles, cars that had reached the end of their useful lives, sometimes with gasoline and oil still in the tank, were driven or pushed into the water at spots where the shoreline dropped quickly to depth. Industrial chemicals went in by night. The logic was simple and, in its way, elegant. Lake Tahoe's depth was effectively infinite by the standards of the era. Whatever went in past a certain point would never be seen again. And for decades, that calculation proved correct. The environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought some of the surface-level dumping to an end. Regulations were enacted. Monitoring began. The states of California and Nevada created the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency in 1969, partly in direct response to research from UC Davis documenting the lake's declining clarity. But the monitoring focused on the surface layers, on nutrients, on sediment runoff, on the visible measures of a lake's health. Nobody was looking at the deep basin floor. The cost was prohibitive. The technology barely existed. And the lake looked clean. Whatever had been deposited in the depths was out of sight, and out of sight meant, for a generation or two, out of mind entirely. The drought that gripped the Sierra Nevada in 2024 was not a sudden event, but the culmination of years of below-average precipitation and rising temperatures. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center's 2024 State of the Lake report documented that Lake Tahoe today is warmer, receives more rain and less snow, and experiences earlier snowmelt than it did a century ago. There are now, on average, 27 fewer below-freezing days per year than there were in 1911. The snowpack that feeds the lake's 63 tributary streams has become unreliable. When inflow drops and evaporation continues at its normal rate, the lake level falls. 9 feet does not sound dramatic for a lake nearly a third of a mile deep. But a drop in lake level is not felt at the bottom. It is felt at the shoreline. And as the water receded during the 2024 drought, it exposed stretches of lakebed that had been submerged for generations. Hikers walking newly revealed beaches began finding things. Tires, bottles, corroded metal objects that had been quietly sitting in shallow water since the post-war years. Easy enough to dismiss as ordinary litter. But then the divers got involved. Colin West is the founder and executive director of Clean Up the Lake, a Lake Tahoe nonprofit that has made it their mission to literally pull trash off the lakebed. West launched the organization and began an ambitious project to conduct an underwater cleanup of all 72 miles of Lake Tahoe's shoreline, diving in water where the average temperature runs between 43 and 63 degrees Fahrenheit, hauling out everything from aluminum cans and sunglasses to engine blocks and pieces of broken boats. By the time the project concluded, his team of divers had removed over 25,000 pounds of debris, more than 4,500 aluminum cans, hundreds of pairs of sunglasses, cell phones, fishing gear, no littering signs, and items ranging from what appear to be engagement rings to entire lampposts. But the drought exposed shallows that West's teams had not previously been able to access. And what they found there had stopped being ordinary litter. They were finding vehicles. Cars from the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, decades-old automobiles sitting on the lakebed in states of remarkable preservation. The cold water that had slowed their decay meant that some retained visible paint. Interior details remained recognizable. License plates on several were still legible. Not rust-eaten hulks, but vehicles frozen in time, sitting on the bottom as if they had only recently arrived. West has spoken in interviews about the disorienting experience of swimming up to a 1950s automobile with his dive light and automatically checking through the window. The same instinct you would have approaching a crash on the highway to see whether anyone was still inside. That instinct says something important about the condition of these cars. They were not archaeological fragments. They were machines. Whatever had happened to put them there, the lake had preserved the evidence with an almost indifferent precision. While divers were working the shallows, something historic was happening in the deep water. On September 5, 2025, for the first time in recorded history, a remotely operated vehicle reached the actual floor of Lake Tahoe. The ROV was called Deep Emerald, a name drawn from the lake's longtime nickname, the Jewel of the Sierra. It was built by the Restoring the Lake Depths Foundation in collaboration with the Tahoe Fund and Seaview Systems, purpose-designed for the specific challenges of Tahoe's depth, near total darkness, extreme pressure, cold that would compromise conventional equipment. The vehicle carried 8 thrusters, an array of powerful LED lights, and a 4K camera capable of capturing detail in conditions of zero ambient light. It was connected to the surface by nearly 2,000 feet of fiber optic tether, allowing researchers on a boat above to watch the descent in real time. More than 3,500 viewers watched it live-streamed online. The ROV descended just slightly south of Tahoe City, dropping through the illuminated upper layers where sunlight still reached, then passing through the transition zone where blue light faded to gray, and then into the permanent black of the deep basin. It traveled approximately 400 to 500 meters across the lakebed during its 12-minute deployment at depth. What the cameras revealed at the bottom was, in one sense, exactly what scientists expected: cold, barren, silty landscape. The lakebed at 1,570 feet appeared as a field of soft sediment, what researchers described as flocculent material, particles of dead algae, inorganic matter, and fine sediment that had drifted down over years and settled in the still, undisturbed deep water. The camera caught patterns in the silt that researchers likened to a starfield. There were no aquatic plants, no fish visible at that depth, very little sign of life. The pressure and cold had made it an almost sterile environment, exactly as the lake's chemistry would predict. But the absence of the dramatic, no sea monster, no sunken treasure ship, no cinematic revelation, is itself informative. What the descent confirmed was that the deepest floor of Lake Tahoe is quiet, still, and almost perfectly preserved. A surface disturbed by nothing. A record of everything that has settled there over thousands of years, undisturbed, simply waiting. And that is the part that matters. Because if the floor is undisturbed, then whatever was deposited there, whether by geology or by human hands, is still there, exactly where it was left. The discoveries at the shoreline level and the first-ever footage of the deepest floor form the two ends of a single, troubling picture. Between those extremes, in the intermediate depths where the ROVs used by environmental researchers have conducted surveys, lies the most disturbing evidence of all. Survey operations working in depths from a few hundred feet down to the deeper basin have documented industrial debris at scales that were not publicly known. Drums and cylindrical containers characteristic of mid-20th century industrial storage. The kind of containers used by the industries that were operating in the Tahoe Basin during the post-war development era: metal processing, automotive services, photographic laboratories, the dry cleaning operations, and laundry facilities that service the hotels and casinos. These containers do not end up at depth by accident. They do not roll in from the shoreline or fall off recreational boats. Someone transported them to the lake and put them in deep water deliberately, with a specific intention that they would never be found. The cold chemistry of Lake Tahoe's deep water, which has preserved those 1950s automobiles in the shallows with enough fidelity that divers instinctively check for occupants, has been working the same preservation on those containers for 70 years. But preservation is not permanence. Metal corrodes even in cold water, given enough time. Seals fail. The contents of those containers, whatever they are not sealed forever. They are in a slow process of becoming part of the lake. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center has been the primary scientific institution monitoring Lake Tahoe's health since 1968. Their clarity measurements, taken annually with the Secchi disk, have documented a long-term decline from the late 1960s through the 1990s, followed by a plateau that has persisted for decades. Researchers have been explicit that targeted investigation is now needed into the nature of the particles reducing clarity, whether they remain primarily the sediment runoff that earlier policies addressed, or whether new factors, including wildfire ash, invasive species, algae changes, and potentially contamination from depth, have altered the equation. The lake is warmer than it has ever been in the modern record. Warmer water means more biological activity. More biological activity means changes to the stratification patterns that have historically kept the deep water isolated from the surface. Lake Tahoe's deep water does not circulate to the surface frequently. The cycle can take years under normal conditions. But as that cycle changes with warming temperatures, the separation between the cold, contaminated depths and the surface water that people swim in and draw drinking water from becomes less reliable. No account of Lake Tahoe's secrets will be complete without confronting the oldest of them, a persistent local belief that the lake's depths contain the victims of organized crime. The mob's presence in the Tahoe region during the casino era is not legend. It is documented history. The Calneva Lodge at North Shore operated under Frank Sinatra's gaming license until 1963, when Nevada's Gaming Control Board revoked it after discovering that Sam Giancana, identified by federal authorities as the boss of the Chicago mob and Al Capone's successor, was present at the property. Giancana was, at that time, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the United States. His presence at a Tahoe casino was not an anomaly. It was an illustration of how thoroughly mob interest had penetrated the region's gambling industry. Casino owner Richard Chartrand was killed by a car bomb in 1968, a killing that was never solved. Carmine Galante, boss of the Bonanno crime family, vacationed at a Lake Tahoe resort in 1975 under FBI and Washoe County Sheriff surveillance. The record of mob activity in the region is real, documented, and specific. What has never been documented, and what remains, as of this writing, in the territory of local legend rather than confirmed fact, is the claim that the lake contains victims of mob violence. The stories have circulated since the 1950s. Locals speak of a section of the lake near the South Shore casinos, referred to informally as the Grave. The rationale is logical in a grim way. The same cold temperatures that preserve the automobiles on the shallower lake bed would, theoretically, preserve organic remains at depth as well. Scientists have confirmed that Tahoe's cold water can significantly slow decomposition. Bodies recovered from the lake years after drowning incidents have sometimes been found in states of remarkable preservation, fueling speculation about what might be preserved at depths that recovery teams cannot reach. In September 2025, when the Deep Emerald ROV made its historic descent and the footage was live-streamed to thousands of viewers, one of the questions the researchers addressed directly was the body legend. They found no evidence of human remains at depth. What the cameras showed was silt, sediment, flocculent material drifting into still water, the quiet, undramatic reality of a lake floor that had not been disturbed in a very long time. That finding does not settle the question entirely. The ROV surveyed a specific location over a 12-minute deployment. Lake Tahoe's basin floor covers an enormous area. Absence of evidence from one location is not evidence of absence across the whole. But it is the closest thing to an answer that technology has yet provided, and the answer it gave was mundane rather than sensational. What the drought exposed and what the ROV documented together constitutes something that the tourism industry, the property owners, and the regulatory agencies around Lake Tahoe are now being forced to confront. The lake has been carrying the weight of its own mid-century history for 7 decades, and that weight is not getting lighter. Colin West's Clean Up the Lake organization, after completing its original 72-mile circumnavigation of the shoreline and removing more than 25,000 pounds of debris, launched a documentary series called What Lies Unseen in 2025, extending the work to lakes across the country and going to greater depths than the original project reached. West has spoken candidly about what divers find when they go below the recreational zone, the reality beneath the surface that the lake's famous clarity does not reveal, because clarity only goes so deep. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center continues its annual clarity monitoring, its annual State of the Lake reports, its decades-long record of a lake that is warmer, cloudier in summer, and more ecologically complex than it was when measurements began. The 2025 report noted that the annual average clarity of 69.2 feet represented a slight improvement from 2024's 62.3 feet, but that the lake remained far from its historic benchmark and that the plateau in clarity that has persisted for decades had not been broken. Researchers are calling for new investigation into the nature of the particles reducing visibility, acknowledging that the factors at work today may be different from those that drove the original decline. The Restoring the Lake Depths Foundation, which built and deployed Deep Emerald, has framed its mission explicitly as the illumination of a part of the lake that has never been studied because it has never been reachable. Their work is ongoing. The first dive proved the technology worked. What comes next is the systematic exploration of a deep basin floor that has been sealed from human observation for the entire history of human presence at Lake Tahoe. What that exploration will reveal is, as yet, unknown. The first descent found silt and sediment, and the quiet marks of geological time. Future dives may find the same, or they may find the accumulated evidence of an industrial era that used the lake's depth as a disposal solution and moved on, leaving the consequences to drain into the water supply of a region that has never known quite what was at the bottom. Here is what is true about Lake Tahoe as it stands today, assembled from what researchers, divers, and environmental scientists have documented and recorded. The lake's clarity, which once reached nearly 100 feet of visible depth and now averages in the upper 60s, has been on a long, slow decline that correlates directly with the post-war development era and has never fully recovered. The lakebed in the shallows contains vehicles, construction debris, and industrial refuse from the 1940s through the 1970s, preserved by cold water in states that still strike experience diverse as uncanny. The deep basin floor has been visited by a human-built vehicle exactly once, in September 2025, and what the camera found was a quiet, undisturbed world of fine sediment that has been accumulating for thousands of years without interruption. The lake is warming, the snowpack feeding it is declining, and the stratification that has historically kept deep water isolated from surface water is changing in ways that scientists are still working to understand. And the stories, the mob legends, the whispered geography of the grave, the tales of bodies preserved at depth in clothes from another era remain stories. Compelling, historically grounded in the real presence of organized crime in the region, consistent with what the lake's chemistry would theoretically allow. But stories, not facts. Not yet. What is a fact is this. Lake Tahoe spent the better part of 7 decades functioning as the world's most beautiful disposal site, and the drought pulled back enough of the curtain to reveal what had been sitting in the shallows all along. The deeper curtain, the one that separates the surface world from the basin floor, was pulled back for 12 minutes on a September afternoon in 2025, and what the camera found was not treasure or horror, but something perhaps more unsettling: stillness. An undisturbed record. Everything that has ever settled to that floor, sitting exactly where it landed, waiting with the patience of geology to be seen. The tourists keep coming. The photographs keep being taken. The surface still catches the Sierra light and returns it in colors that do not exist anywhere else on Earth. That part is real. That part is not a lie. But the picture is incomplete, as it has always been, because the picture stops at the surface, and the surface, for all its legendary clarity, is only the beginning of what this lake contains. Every time the water level drops a little further, the beginning gets a little longer. And somewhere below the beginning, in the cold and the dark and the perfect stillness of 1,600 feet, the rest of the story is still waiting to be read.